economy is slowing, and the ISM manufacturing index suggests that narrative is still in place. We get a reading of 48.5, which is down from 48.7 in May. And we have to, other than a brief peak above 50 in March of this year, you have to go back to September of 2022 before you get a extended period above 50. So the slowdown in manufacturing continues, and that's what you see in all of the sub-indexes. New orders is up, but still under 50 at 49.3. Production slips a bit, 48.5. Employment slips to 49.3. Inventories are lower, and also prices. Now, that's the one bit of good news here. 52.1 down from 57.0, and that would suggest some perhaps more room for the Fed in terms of when it might want to lower interest rates, and suggest that perhaps we'll see some lower price numbers in the CPI when we get it next week.
And before we get to CPI next week, we actually do have a jobs report on Friday. Of course, a little bit of a weird week, the way that the schedule worked out with the July 4th holiday. But what are we expecting to see there, Mike McKee?
Well, we're expecting to see a lot of traders on the beach, but the junior traders they leave behind are expecting 188,000 jobs. Now, that may change during the week as we get more labor market data, and an unchanged 4% unemployment rate. Now, this will fall into the same category as I was talking about with ISM. Does it keep the narrative going of a slowing economy, but not one falling off a cliff? If we get a big jump in unemployment, that's going to worry the Fed. If we get a big drop in unemployment, then everybody's got to refigure their Fed cut scenarios. So Friday's going to be an important day, whether you're in the office or looking in from the Hamptons or the Jersey Shore or something like that.
Well, I will not be in the office, but I will be following those job report figures. Mike McKee, thank you so much. Meanwhile, we are awaiting that Trump immunity ruling from the Supreme Court, but in the meantime, we do have a decision coming from the top court, and that is that they will allow swipe fee challenge to go ahead, and that is in a blow to the regulators. So in that decision, that swipe card decision, it lets the old rules be challenged. Of course, that is the first of several decisions that we are expecting from the Supreme Court this morning. We'll bring you, of course, those as soon as we have them. But let's turn back to the markets now, because we're joined now by Megan Horniman. She is Verdant's Chief Investment Officer, joining me now. And Megan, I want to bring you a very boring stat. This comes from my producer, Dan Curtis. Basically, that if you take a look at the S&P 500, it's on average 0.3% move each day in June. That is the quietest month by that measure since the pandemic started. And when you think of that lack of volatility, is that basically just a summer slump, or does that seem like basically a coiled spring to you?
I think it has more to do with the fact that markets don't really know what to expect from the Federal Reserve. So it's been a very quiet month. There's not big trades being put on, and that's because there still is so much uncertainty on when the Fed's going to be able to come in and cut interest rates. And the other side, if you look at the fixed income market, that's also, aside from the past couple of days, that's been really stuck in a range as well. So I think you're just looking at investors and market participants that aren't really sure of what direction the Fed's going to be able to do and what the economy's doing.
And so where do you stand on all of that? Of course, a lot of cross currents, and the fact that we are in the middle of summer and liquidity is maybe a little bit wanting there. How are you positioned right now?
So we're a little bit cautious about the economy. That's been our bigger concern, because we do think that you are seeing the economy slow pretty quickly. The consumer's been our biggest concern all year, because eventually the consumer would have to start to slow spending. It just wasn't sustainable with credit card debt at a record high and rates near over 20% for credit cards. Then on the other side, we are concerned about that inflation's just going to be a bit stickier than the Fed wants or anybody investors want, and how they're pricing this market. That gives the Fed less flexibility than I think these hefty valuations are showing. So with that being said, we're looking at our positions, making sure that rebalancing where necessary with some of these growth areas that have run up so much, and then sitting with extra cash on the sidelines. We do think that volatility will pick up in the second half of this year as the economy continues to slow and we start to look at what the Fed's going to be able to do, and that will present some opportunities, I think, for the long run.
Well, you touched on it a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit more about what cautious positioning looks like. It sounds like cash is your friend here. Maybe you're rebalancing out of those growth areas of the equity market. How does fixed income fit in? And when you think about quality in this market and defensiveness, for a lot of people, that means tech.
Yeah, but from a fixed income perspective, though, here's the one thing that we have concerned about fixed income, and specifically the Treasury side. In the Treasuries, there's so much supply. Last week, the Congressional Budget Office came out with new projections for issuance. This supply is getting scary, and this is eventually going to weigh on interest rates, which, as you mentioned, people are looking at tech as a defensive. It's not so defensive when you see volatility in the Treasury market. You're seeing that today. Tech's off today because yields are higher today. So I think that there's a risk there from not just in the fixed income market, in the long end of the Treasury curve. So we're more defensive there, hugging in that intermediate part of the curve. And from the equity side, we don't like tech right now. We think that the valuations are too elevated. It's priced in way too much of this momentum for AI. When we say defensive in equity markets, think about some of the value sectors over those cyclical growth type of sectors.
So when you say you don't like tech, does that mean you're neutral? Does that mean you're underweight? It feels like tech, to your point, valuations are quite elevated, but even still, it feels almost too big to ignore.
We have, if you look at our positioning, we're overweight value over growth. So naturally, we'll be slightly underweight of the S&P 500 on a technology basis. It's kind of when you have a value over growth tilt, you're going to be underweight technology. The valuations, I think that some of this, the frenzy around AI, eventually is going to top out. And we've seen that happen right now. I think that you're going to see, unless we get this, earnings to continue to validate this AI boom, you're going to see some volatility in these tech names. They've just run up way too far, too fast.
What would make you reassess your thinking on tech? Do you need some sort of correction there, or do you need something more substantial on sort of the narrative fundamental side?
I think it's a valuation correction. I don't think that technology, you should completely abandon it forever. I just think there's going to be opportunities where valuations will just get a little bit, I think, more realistic. And then don't forget that earnings estimates for this year and next year really haven't been downgraded. But you are talking about the economy that's slowing more than some had anticipated, but you haven't seen that in the earnings revisions. So if we get earnings revisions downward, we get valuations a bit more realistic, that's when we'll look to enter into tech.
All right, Megan, sit tight for just a couple minutes. We're going to come back with you after the break. But before we get there, let's take a look at what's moving underneath these markets right now. We're going to do that with Bloomberg's Simone Foxman, and kicking off with some M&A news.
Yeah, that's right. This is Boeing's deal for Spirit AeroSystems. Of course, all of this is to address some of these manufacturing defects, especially after that piece of the fuselage blew off a plane in early January. We understand this deal is going to be worth $4.7 billion. All-cash transaction, 30% premium to that February 29th price. That was when the two companies confirmed a merger talks. But we're also watching shares of Boeing here, in part because Bloomberg News reporting late yesterday that the DOJ is going to charge the company with criminal fraud for violating a 2021 deferred prosecution agreement. Now, the company still has to decide whether or not they want to plead guilty or whether they want to go to trial, but none of this particularly great for Boeing. That said, shares are up about 2.6% this morning.
Yeah, it's an interesting contrast there, of course. Boeing shares having actually a great Monday. Talk to me about Chewy, though, because Roaring Kitty, he appears.
Yeah, and what's interesting here, we saw shares spiking as much as close to 30% in pre-market, but now down about 4%. It all started with a tweet from Keith Gill, or a post, I suppose I should say these days, on X, of a cartoon of a dog that raised potential interest that Roaring Kitty may be taking a stake either in Chewy or in Petco. Turns out it's in Chewy. We got that filing this morning. 9 million shares. That's roughly $250 million, or 6.6% of the outstanding. One interesting comment that Steve Sosnick at Interactive Brokers made is that, this is a filing. This isn't just tweets and cryptic memes. But the best part about the story?
Tell me.
Filing boxes in in this disclosure filing included "I am a cat" or "I am not a cat."
Oh my gosh.
Of course, "I am not a cat" was interestingly checked.
That is interesting. A little bit more details on Keith Gill there, but even still, you see the volatility making its way through Chewy shares. And bring it home. Tell me about Birkenstock.
Yeah, this has been one of the most highly traded, high-volume shares this morning, though we're seeing some of those gains come off. Last week, the shares fell 11.5%, in part because insiders, especially the private equity owner L. Catterton, filed to sell shares. But now UBS's Jay Sol upgrading this name to buy. He says the expansion of the direct-to-consumer strategy is actually going better than he anticipated. You know, the market sees some of these overhangs, especially around this growth that the Barbie movie generated. He thinks there's more important things to focus on. He sets a price target of $85. Shares were trading this morning around $55 a share. Citi also has actually a buy rating on this one, $65 a share. That was reinstated. So less excitement, but still a little bit of positivity for a name that's really been on a pretty good run lately. Looking at this year to date, 13.3% gains.
Yeah, and of course, another 1.5 gain today. Not too bad on a Monday. Bloomberg's Simone Foxman, thank you so much. Now, coming up, the Supreme Court is set to release the final opinions of this term. We'll preview the Trump immunity decision next. This is Bloomberg. Well, we're awaiting the Supreme Court ruling on former President Donald Trump's claim that he is immune from charges over attempts to overturn the 2020 election. Now, just a few minutes ago, we got the Supreme Court's decision on swipe fees, with the High Court dealing a blow to the authority of federal agencies. Joining us now from Washington is Bloomberg Balance of Power co-anchor Kayleigh Lyons. And when it comes to the immunity decision, it seems like really the heart of the matter is whether Donald Trump was acting as the president or as a private citizen.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Katie. It all comes down to what qualifies as an official act versus a private act. Donald Trump and his defense team, of course, argue that he should be immune from prosecution entirely for everything that took place while he was president. And the justices in argument did seem a bit skeptical of that argument, the idea that it would give the president essentially blanket authority to do whatever he or she would like. However, they also expressed skepticism around the idea that they should just entirely throw away Donald Trump's argument, essentially teasing the idea that they may send it back to a lower court to divvy up what is an official versus private act and potentially, therefore, drawing this process out even further. I would just remind you, Katie, that, of course, an appeals court much earlier this year rejected Donald Trump's claim. The Supreme Court then decided to take it up. They heard arguments in this case in April, and here they are on the very last day of the term, still awaiting the opinion from the court. So they have made this process quite lengthy. And, of course, whether or not Donald Trump goes to trial in the case brought against him here in Washington related to his efforts to overturn the 2020 election, it may not actually be able to do so by November, depending on how the justices ruled today. So the timing here is everything.
Yeah, that window, of course, is very, very narrow. But let's talk a little bit about the fact that we're having this conversation on July 1st. Of course, the term being extended. How rare is it to see actually the term go into July?
It's quite rare, Katie. We haven't seen this in a number of years since the COVID era, where we also saw the court take the term into July. Of course, it's only one day past the last day of June, which is the traditional deadline, but still it is a bit unusual. And I would point out it's not just the immunity case that we had to wait on until this first day of July. We're still awaiting an opinion on social media rules in Texas and Florida, whether or not they can censor or monitor content on their platform based on those state laws, or whether there is some kind of violation of free speech there. And of course, they also ruled in this swipe fees case, essentially throwing into question the statute of limitations on when government regulation could be challenged. So it's three opinions that the court has waited until the last second here on. But of course, the one with the greatest political ramification and potentially precedent setting for not just Donald Trump, but for the presidency going well into the future is this immunity case, which is why it's highly, highly consequential.
Yeah, a historic day, a historic ruling indeed. Our thanks to Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons. And a good reminder, too, that we are awaiting other decisions. We've got a couple that have already landed, and we'll bring you all of that coverage as we have it. But before we get there, let's get back now to Megan Hornerman. She is Verdant's Chief Investment Officer. And when you think about political risk, not just election risk that we're dealing with, but also, too, all of this drama heading up to the election as well. I mean, how are you thinking about that through the lens of putting together a portfolio?
So political risk is just one of the many risks that we see in portfolios right now. The political risk goes into the election, but then also what is each candidate going to focus on in 2025? That's where things can have an impact on portfolios. Are we talking about tariffs, which may cause the Federal Reserve to have a little bit more of a thorn in their side with inflation? These are the things that we think you have to take a look at. But at the end of the day, politics is just one thing. It can be a source of volatility in the markets for many different reasons, as you mentioned, but really we're focusing on fundamentals, valuations, because whether you look at your portfolio in a very short period of time or long periods of time, like you should, these political pendulums tend to swing in all economic cycles. So we would rather look at what are the underlying fundamentals of the economy, underlying fundamentals within the sectors, the companies, and then what is the valuation? Is the downside and upside risk being balanced?
Well, it's interesting. You take a look at what the sell side is saying so far. There was a really interesting note out from the likes of Morgan Stanley, for example, saying that if we get another Trump presidency, maybe we could see a steeper yield curve. You see rate cuts getting pulled forward, and then you think about sort of the long end of the yield curve, maybe being pressured higher from some of those tariff policies. Is it time to be thinking in that way? Do you think that that's a fruitful exercise to go through, thinking of the Trump trade or the Biden trade, for example?
I think it doesn't hurt to look at that. I mean, clients do have those questions a lot. What is my portfolio going to look like? But at the end of the day, it's not just necessarily who sits in the presidential seat. It's what does Congress look like, too? Because there's a lot of things that we have to tackle over the next year or so, and including from the debt side. There's whether it's tax cuts, tax increases. This is all way too early to even discuss. But at the end of the day, the one thing that's on the table that needs to be addressed is what we think is the budget deficit. That can put pressure on the long end of the yield curve. So whether that's Donald Trump in office or President Biden, it doesn't matter, because when you're looking at the long end of the Treasury curve, there's just so much supply that we could see those yields rise higher.
Well, when you look down the ticket, I mean, one of the narratives out there is that markets like gridlock. Does that logic still apply in this situation?
I think so. The markets typically do like gridlock. You're not going to get, there's no chance for some major surprises to go through when you have gridlock. So I do think that's good for the markets over the long run.
And let's, of course, look outside just the U.S. because we do have elections happening elsewhere in the world. Indeed, you take a look at what's going on in France right now. I mean, when you think about volatility in elections outside the U.S., how much of that matters for when you're thinking about the U.S. versus the rest of the world, and where do you fall?
I think when you look at what's going on in France, obviously that's having a much bigger impact on their markets, their local equity markets, their bond markets. You're seeing that spread from between German bonds. You've seen that widen out over the recent weeks since this has been a development. It is something you can't ignore it because in an overall diversified portfolio, you should have some international equities in there. It just is when you look and you're well diversified that over the long run, these things should smooth themselves out and we'll get back to how you should value companies. And it's not necessarily just the political environment.
And Megan, before I let you go, I mean, when you look across everything that we've been talking about over the past 20 minutes, of course, the economy, the Federal Reserve, the global picture as well, what is the biggest risk out there?
I think it's inflation. I think that inflation is a bit stickier than the Fed would like it to be. And it's one thing also that's very easy to reaccelerate if the Fed or even the global central banks get too dovish. That's the biggest risk that we see.
All right, Megan, really enjoyed this conversation. Have a great week. Our thanks to Megan Hornerman. She is Verdant's Chief Investment Officer. And as promised, we do have more news from the Supreme Court, that decision that Kaylee was talking about on state social media laws, particularly when it comes to Texas and Florida. The Supreme Court issuing really a mixed decision on those state social media laws. It's going to send that back to the lower courts, of course, when it comes to those state social media laws. We'll continue to follow that one, of course, as we await for the big decision, and that is the ruling on Trump's immunity. So we'll continue to follow that, but still ahead on this program, we're going to take a look at the companies making the most social buzz today in our Social Climber segment up next. This is Bloomberg. All right, it's time now for Social Climbers. A look at the stocks making waves on social media this morning. And first up, Nike hoping cheaper kicks will give it a leg up. The sports apparel retailer is said to be rolling out a new line of sneakers that cost $100 or less. Nike, of course, got trampled last week after a dismal sales forecast. Next up, Air France is warning that the Summer Olympics will hurt its bottom line. The airline says passengers are avoiding Paris in the summer to avoid possible disruptions and high prices during the games. The French themselves are also said to be postponing their own holidays to avoid any travel chaos. And finally, here's a collab you never knew you needed. Kate Spade is teaming up with Heinz Ketchup on a limited edition collection of clothing and accessories. Now, the partnership will include tote bags made to look like ketchup package, t-shirts, keychains, and phone cases. It's condiment couture at its finest. And of course, you can follow all the latest company buzz on TREN Go on your Bloomberg terminal. Meanwhile, you take a look at markets on this first day of the second half, and it is a green day, but it's pretty quiet, just like June was. You can see the S&P 500 pretty much unchanged. Same thing if you take a look at the NASDAQ 100, and that sell-off in treasuries is continuing. The 10-year yield up about 6 basis points. Now, coming up, the Supreme Court is set to rule on Trump immunity. We'll speak to Chara Torres Spelizzi. She is Stetson University law professor. Next. This is Bloomberg. Court ruling. We're going to do that with Bloomberg Balance of Power co-host Kaylee Lines joining us from Washington. And Kaylee, what do we know so far?
Well, Katie, the opinion has just come down, and you're exactly right. This is a partial victory for former President Donald Trump, though not one in its entirety. The court ruling that under the constitutional structure of separated powers, the nature of presidential power entitles a former president to absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions with his conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority. It says that he is either entitled to or at least presumptive immunity from prosecution for all of his official acts. But this is the key. It goes on to say there is no immunity for unofficial acts. And this was really the question here. What constitutes an official act of the presidency versus the private act? What was Donald Trump doing as president versus a presidential candidate? This was what justices were questioning in these arguments back in April, and could, of course, have great consequence for the prosecution of Donald Trump in the case brought against him here in Washington by special counsel Jack Smith. He, of course, in that case is charged with 4 separate counts, 2 of which potentially complicated by a Supreme Court decision from last week around what constitutes obstruction, because he has been charged with obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding. But essentially what the court is doing here is ruling that Donald Trump is at least partially immune for official actions. It's going to be up to courts to actually sort through what is official and unofficial. What this all means, though, is that this is going to delay likely this case going to trial as we get closer and closer to the election in November. Joining me now with more is Bloomberg Wall Street Week host David Weston. David, of course, you also clerked at the Supreme Court. This is obviously a highly consequential ruling with not implications only for former President Trump, but all the presidents after him.
Yeah, I think, Kelly, you summarized it exactly right. I mean, on the one hand, the former president, Donald Trump, wanted just absolute immunity, the case to be over. That did not happen. The case will continue. At the same time, as you say, he does have immunity for official acts. The question is, what did he do that maybe was unofficial? That's going to have to be decided as a matter of fact as well as law. And at least from the oral argument, as you know, Kelly, President Trump's own lawyer said that probably should go back down to the district court. We have to determine that. So I think we've got some more litigation to go on. As you know, it's a heyday for the lawyers once again, Kayleigh.
Well, and the question is going to be, David, to what extent this can actually be sorted out in the process of a trial. If this is handed back down to Judge Tanya Chutkan, who is overseeing that trial in the Washington case, can actually the delineation of what is an official act versus a private act be worked out within the context of it? Or does all of that have to be sorted before the trial can formally begin?
Well, I'm speculating here, but normally the way this would work is you go down, you have pretrial motions, and there's motion practice before the district court. There may well be fact-finding. There may be some discovery about exactly what was going on behind the scenes, and then there'll be arguments, and then the court will make a ruling as to what in fact was official, what was not official, of what was alleged in the indictment, and they'll go forward. Presumably, if she finds some things that were unofficial, therefore are not subject to immunity, you go ahead with a trial, and then that could be subject to review and appeal.
And it would just extend this process even longer. That is what is also so influential about this decision, David, not only the precedent that it sets for the highest office in the country, but the idea that it's coming within the context of a presidential election cycle in which the defendant in question is running for president of the United States to take the Oval Office once more. We know that the court heard arguments in this case back in April, months ago. That was several months after it agreed to take up the case after the appeals court had rejected Donald Trump's claim of immunity. The court here has not only decided to hand it back down to courts, prolonging the process, but did so whether or not it is supposed to take politics into question, knowing that this likely would mean this does not go to trial before November.
Yeah, the Supreme Court in general, in my experience at least, tries to pride itself in not being political, sort of like the Federal Reserve Board says we really don't pay attention to that. We just take them as they come, make the decisions. But it's not just, of course, that he's running for president, but it's entirely possible he will become president again. And if that were to happen, he would presumably have the authority to stop the prosecution from going forward. I think that's a key element here, given how much delay is likely to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking through the opinion here, David, to get to the dissent, one of which is authored with Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who says, today's decision to grant former presidents criminal immunity reshapes the institution of the presidency. They say it makes a mockery of the principle foundational to our Constitution and system of government that no man is above the law. That's ultimately really what the court was deciding here, whether, in fact, at least in some cases, when acting in an official capacity, the president is above the law?
Well, that's one way to characterize it, and obviously the dissent would put it that way. If I can present the argument on the other side that was presented to the Supreme Court, it was that if you allow former presidents to be indicted for anything they did in office, it will really curtail the ability of the current president to exercise their discretion, that you have to be very careful. And this is why we have immunity of all sorts. I mean, immunity for police officers, for example, so that they're not too limited in how they exercise their discretion. So that would be the countervailing value. Certainly, we want no person to be above the law, including the President of the United States. That was decided in the United States versus Nixon, actually, with the Nixon tapes. That's been a bedrock principle. But on the other hand, you have to consider, on the other hand, could you be curtailing the ability of a president to exercise his discretion and do what he should be doing in his job?
Well, David, I'm so glad you brought up the Nixon tapes. That was, of course, the Watergate case in which I believe it took the Supreme Court only a matter of weeks to actually come down with an opinion, not months, as we have seen in this case. And I'm pleased to say a former Watergate prosecutor is joining us now. Nick Ackerman is with us. Nick, welcome to Bloomberg. Thank you so much for being with us on what is a historic day. I know you've probably only had a matter of minutes to read this opinion, but your initial reaction, please, to the court granting Donald Trump at least partial immunity for his official acts.
I think the bottom line is this decision is really meaningless in a lot of ways. None of the acts that are alleged in that indictment are official acts of the President of the United States. He's alleged essentially to get involved in the presidential election, to try and overturn it, trying to do things that have nothing to do with his powers under the U.S. Constitution. Coming up with fake electors to put before Congress, trying to get his vice president to throw the election to him by using phony electors, trying to put the attorney general in a position to send out a fraudulent letter to battleground states, telling them that there was fraud in the election when there wasn't, that he was spreading the big lie that there was a fraud in the election. None of this is an official act of the President of the United States. Filing false statements with a federal court about there being election fraud is not an official act of the President of the United States. What really irks me about this opinion is that you could just look at the indictment and understand that everything that alleged here has nothing to do with his official acts. This is no different than what President Nixon did in Watergate when he directed his aides to call the FBI, to call the CIA, to call the FBI to tell them to stop the Watergate investigation. Sure, that was official that he was having his aides do this, but this was not something that is under his authority as president to undermine the justice system. It's not Donald Trump's authority as president to try and undermine a presidential election and the peaceful transfer of power.
Well, Nick, as we consider the peaceful transfer of power question, of course, keeping in mind that all of this goes back to actions taken around efforts to overturn the 2020 election and the events of January 6, 2021, it's also worth keeping in mind that while we got this opinion from the court today, we got another consequential opinion from the court last week on January 6 defendants, at least limiting the use of the Enron doctrine, what could eventually be obstruction of an official proceeding. They've sided with that defendant, which has potential consequence not just for him, but for Donald Trump himself in this case. How should we consider that opinion together with the opinion we have got today and what it will mean for this case moving forward?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, the obstruction count that the Supreme Court dealt with last week would not in any way undermine the allegations against Donald Trump. What the court found was, and I totally think this was off base, was that because it was passed after the Enron scandal and in response to the Enron scandal, it has to do with falsifying evidence. Well, in this particular indictment against Donald Trump with respect to the January 6 matter, it does allege that he came up with phony documents, namely the documentation underpinning the phony electors. So in a sense, the decision last week really is not going to have any impact on this case against Donald Trump. Secondly, it just seems to me that what the court did for a Supreme Court that has been so emphasizing history and what has gone on in the past, what they completely overlooked, and which Justice Barrett basically decided in her dissent, was that there was a history here with the initial obstruction statute, Section 1503, that was the only statute that was out there during Watergate. And there were holes in that statute, one of which was an obstruction on Congress. And that was what this statute was intended to cover. So, in a way, it was a bad decision, but it's not going to affect the indictment against Donald Trump.
So, Nick, I want to come back to what you said and agree with part of it and also question part of it. On the one hand, you're right that there are certain allegations made in the indictment that even Trump's counsel in the Supreme Court conceded would be, at that point they were talking about private acts, that is, putting up fake electors, for example, or knowingly certifying improperly the election. At the same time, I've only gotten a chance to read the head notes. As you know, as a lawyer, that's not the way to do this. But I read the head notes. The Supreme Court really specifically went through some that said those things are official acts that are alleged in the indictments. There are others that I think they said were more troublesome. So in fairness to the Supreme Court, they did go through the indictment and they drew a difference between those two, and they found some things that are official. Do you just think Chief Justice Roberts was wrong?
I don't see how he could possibly be right based on the allegations in that indictment. Everything that Donald Trump did was getting himself involved in trying to undermine the election. He was, for example, in Georgia. He has no constitutional authority to do anything in Georgia with respect to their election in terms of coming up with who their electors will be. That is not the job of the president. Being involved in his own election is a very personal matter. None of this did he have the right to do except to file various court actions, all of which he lost, some 60 some odd court actions that he lost. I don't see how just based on this indictment, somebody can't go through and say each one of these was a personal matter, all intended to benefit Donald Trump, to undermine the election knowingly and willfully, and he knew that what he was saying was all a big lie straight through. I don't see that this is going to be a very difficult matter for Judge Chutkan to look at and decide that all of these matters that are alleged in that indictment are not official acts.
Do you expect, Nick, that Judge Chutkan can do that within the context of a trial already underway? Is this something that can be sorted out within those proceedings, or will everything need to be complete before she can actually set a trial date, keeping in mind she's told the parties they will have 3 months to prepare for trial?
Well, first of all, I haven't read the opinion, so I don't know what the Supreme Court has directed her to do. But certainly the only way to do this is to actually take in the evidence, get proffers on the evidence from the government, and then to make a determination on the actual evidence. An indictment is just allegations. So what you really need here is some kind of indication of what that evidence is, and to have that evidence before the court. So I think you're right. In some ways, you can't really make a decision on this until you put that evidence out there, or at least get a proffer from the government as to what is backing up that evidence. So, yes, I think this gets a little complicated. On the other hand, I have not read that opinion, so I'm not exactly sure what the Supreme Court expects under these circumstances, whereas in any case with an indictment, you only have allegations.
So, Nick, this has been very helpful to me, actually, listening to you about this. But correct me if I'm wrong. I think what you're saying is you don't disagree with what the principles the Supreme Court laid out. That is sort of official versus unofficial. You just think it's a really easy case. And when it goes back to the district court, it won't take them very long to resolve it.
Yeah, it's a really easy case. But what really bothers me here is that what they've done is they've played into Donald Trump's ploy of delay, delay, delay. There was no reason for the Supreme Court to have listened and decided this case in the first instance. They could have done this on an actual evidentiary record that would have taken place before Judge Chutkan. Then you would have had real facts to rule on. And here, like I said before, an indictment is not evidence. It's simply a listing of allegations. And so the idea that somehow you have to get that evidence out before you even put it before a jury, or even put it out so that the defense gets a second crack at the evidence when it actually goes to the jury. It's contrary to how our system works.
Is there anything in the way of Judge Chutkan getting this resolved pretty quickly?
I don't see it. I mean, I know she said 3 months, but this is a pretty simple case. It's one defendant. I know judges in the Southern District of New York that would have put this to trial in 30 days. So I think it's ready to go to trial. It's a question of how quickly this whole issue about official acts can be decided. To me, it's a no-brainer. Just read the indictment. And certainly the government can back up those allegations with very specific evidence, much of which has already been presented to the public in the January 6th committee hearings.
Well, fair point. And Nick, of course, we're viewing this through the lens of what the implications are for Donald Trump, who has weighed in on this now, posting on Truth Social that this is a, quote, big win for our Constitution and democracy, proud to be an American. But obviously, Nick, this goes well beyond just Donald Trump. The court is finding here that under the system of separated powers, and I'm reading from the opinion drafted by Chief Justice Roberts, the president may not be prosecuted for exercising his core constitutional powers. What does this mean about how those powers of the president may look different going forward?
I don't think it makes any difference at all. Look, we've only had this problem arise twice in our history. It was with Richard Nixon and now with Donald Trump. I mean, even the other scandals that we had in the past, like the Teapot Dome scandal, the president wasn't involved in that. It was one of his cabinet members. This is such a rare instance for any kind of president to be accused of actually committing a crime. This is extremely rare. Every single president we've had has been above board, has never been involved in criminal activity like these two presidents. There was no reason to have this opinion and delay this case till after the election. I mean, that is effectively what may have happened here. Again, I haven't read the opinion, and it may be that Judge Chutkan can cut through this pretty quickly. But it's outrageous that so much time has gone by simply to state a principle that a president who's exercising his normal constitutional powers cannot be prosecuted for a crime. There is nothing extraordinary about that principle or about that rule.
Nick, I wonder, as somebody with prosecutorial experience, is there anything that the special counsel could have done to bring this case more narrowly to avoid this problem?
I don't see it. I mean, everything they had in here essentially alleged a overall plan, starting with the big lie that Trump lost the election, that there was fraud in the election, that there were dead people that voted, et cetera, et cetera. All of that surrounded all of the different acts that Donald Trump took. They're all alleged in the indictment. What the special counsel did do was to try and get this to the Supreme Court immediately, bypassing the circuit court, just like we did in the Watergate case with the tapes argument, which the Supreme Court then did accept. I mean, the whole thing just to me feels a lot more political than it did back in 1974, when you had members of the Supreme Court who were appointed by Richard Nixon, who basically came down on the side of the special counsel and against Richard Nixon, whereas here the feel is that these Supreme Court justices that were appointed by Donald Trump did everything they could to buy into his delay strategy.
Well, and of course, it was the 6 conservative justices that ruled this way. It was the 3 liberal justices who dissented. I read earlier, Nick, from the dissent drafted by Sotomayor, who reads in part at the very end, never in the history of our republic has a president had reason to believe he would be immune from criminal prosecution if he used the trappings of his office to violate the criminal law. She ends her words with fear for our democracy, I dissent. In our final minute here, Nick, how does this make you feel about the state of American democracy in these 3 branches of government?
Not great. I'm not feeling good about the Supreme Court. Between what we know about 2 of those members who should have recused themselves on this decision, and how this came out and how this was dragged out, I'm really not feeling good about the state of our democracy. compared to what happened back in 1974 with a Supreme Court that was appointed mainly by Republican presidents.
All right, Nick Ackerman, former Watergate prosecutor. It is great to get your perspective on this historic day, a day in which, of course, the Supreme Court has said that Donald Trump does have partial immunity for official acts, effectively delaying his trial here in Washington. And David Weston, host of Wall Street Week, joining me as we break this historic news. It is quite a day in American history with a precedent set for many presidents to come. And with that, Katie Greifeld, we'll send it back to you.
All right, Kaylee Lyons, thank you so much for that coverage. And of course, Kaylee Lyons is Bloomberg Balance of Power co-host in Washington, and there's much more coverage ahead with Balance of Power today at noon Eastern Time. This is Bloomberg.
It's the countdown to the market open as we bring you the first trades across Europe.
We'll debate the most important stories and what will drive the big investment decisions throughout the morning. I'm Guy Johnson.
I'm Kriti Gupta.
And I'm Anna Edwards. Join us every weekday morning for the opening trade, live at 7 a.m. here in London.
Only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
And of course, we are digesting that decision from the High Court, the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that Donald Trump has some immunity from criminal charges for trying to reverse the 2020 election results. Of course, we are keeping an eye on these markets as well. On the first trading day of the second half, let's get some context with Abigail Doolittle.
We're starting off with just a little bit of a bearish tone, Katie, or maybe a mixed tone. We'll be taking a look at some of the other indexes in a moment, but you can see the NASDAQ 100 here. The futures overnight had been primarily higher, a nice gain up 0.4%, and then right around the time of the eco data, the ISM that came out that was just a little bit below expectations, manufacturing, we've seen a bit of a plunge, which was ironic. I guess it had to do with yields going higher, but it's ironic that yields went higher as that eco data came in a little bit light. Net right now, we're looking at a 0.3% decline at the lows, down more than that, so some intraday volatility. As for the S&P 500, the last time I looked, it was still higher, but now Dow down 0.2%. And the big culprit here, one of them, I should say, is NVIDIA. NVIDIA down 1.6%, firmly in correction territory, but off of its lows. At the lows, down more than 2%. A lot of this having to do with the perception that maybe too far, too fast, take some chips off the table. Ahead of this correction, the stock had been up 180% year to date based on some of the phenomenal quarters and guides that they put up around AI. Also very interesting, and this is the true culprit in terms of stocks being pressured, I would guess. We have yields going higher. The 10-year yield up 8 basis points, close to a 450, and that is helping out the Bloomberg Dollar Index, also pressing on stocks. As for NVIDIA, because it is the third biggest weighting to the S&P 500, and from a sentiment standpoint, here's a 3-month chart, and it's really interesting. So this is the 100-day moving average. On the last quarter, you can see, as often happens when they put up a good quarter, gapped higher. Sometimes these are breakaway gaps that don't fill, but now we're looking at a possible topping pattern here. If below 108, we are very likely to see that gap fill to take NVIDIA closer to that 100-day moving average, or let's just call it, this is below that level, but let's call it 90 or so. If that happens as the third biggest weighting to the S&P 500, again, sentiment, that could be an interesting move potentially during this month of July, earnings, and of course, the Fed. As for some other movers on the day, Tesla up 5% ahead of its EV delivery for the second quarter announcement tomorrow. Coinbase higher with Bitcoin up 3%. Meta, on the other hand, there are some EU concerns, down 1.7%. And then Chewy, this is a really interesting one, Katie, in the pre-market up more than 30% on the disclosure of a 6.6% stake, passive stake by Keith Gill, also known as Roaring Kitty. But now shares have actually reversed and are down about 3.9%.
All right, Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much. Of course, a lot of movement under the surface, even though it seems like the indexes are a little bit boring right now. That's really been the story of the past several months as well. Now, coming up, the CEO of Turo joins Bloomberg TV at 11:30 a.m. New York time. But that does it for Bloomberg Markets. I'm Katie Greifeld, and this is Bloomberg.
heart of where innovation, money, and power collide in Silicon Valley and beyond. This is Bloomberg Technology with Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow.
I'm Caroline Hyde at Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York.
And I'm Ed Ludlow in San Francisco. This is Bloomberg Technology.
Coming up, we bring you the latest in markets as NVIDIA struggles. We're going to talk macro and micro with Nancy Curtin from Alti Tiedemann Global.
Plus, we have the latest from Washington as the Supreme Court sends social media laws back to lower courts.
And Qualcomm has become the new front-of-shirt sponsor for Manchester United. Are chips the new crypto? We discuss that and so much more throughout the hour, but first we check in on these markets. And we're struggling for direction, I think, can be what's really the read across. We start the new half of the year, and we're up about 0.1% on the Nasdaq more broadly, but it seems to be the bond market that's dictating some of that caution in the equity market. Yields push higher, some 8 basis points. Read that what you will. Is that caution as to what's happening over in Europe? Is it worries about what's happening in the United States in terms of ultimately fiscal spending coming with whoever runs the country post-November? And I think also what's happening, though, is the political risk, actually a bit of a relief over in France. The CAC 40 rising more than a percentage point as we do see perhaps a push to curtail what might be the most right-winger policies that could be enacted over in France as many rush to see what happens in the second round of voting. We look at the economic effect, not the political. Let's have a look at what's happening in terms of crypto, though, because the risk asset of choice here on the Technology Show, we're up 1.4%, 62,755. A bit of a risk-on attitude when it comes to Bitcoin, Ed, but way off our highs of previous. What are you watching on the micro?
There's a lot going on throughout the hour. Let's start with NVIDIA. A headline hit just before we came on air from Reuters, citing anonymous sources that French antitrust regulators are getting ready to charge NVIDIA over anti-competitive practices. You'll remember in September, those dawn raids in NVIDIA's French offices or facilities. We'll continue to track it. I'd point out the stock is off session lows, and broadly speaking, chip stocks are lower anyway. There's been some selling across the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, but we'll continue to monitor that one. Tesla's going to give us second quarter delivery numbers at some point in the next 24 to 48 hours. We'll go to Craig Trudell and preview those. And then there's the Qualcomm Manchester United front of shirt sponsorship tie-up. It says Snapdragon, and we'll show it to you later on. By the way, it's July 1st, so happy third quarter to you, Caroline. Happy second half of the year. We got a data guy at Bloomberg Technology, Terrell Holt, and he's put together this fantastic chart. This is the S&P 500, and at the start of the year, the first half of 24, the S&P 500 is up about 14%, right? So he went back and crunched the numbers. Where the S&P 500 has risen by double digits in the first half of the year, more often than not, it's gone on to have some pretty big gains in the second half of the year. So that's kind of the question, right? What happens next as we enter this second half of 2024? This chart, based on history, would indicate we continue to climb higher. Do we? Who knows?
Well, there's someone who might well know, or at least can align our bets a little bit clearer. Nancy Curtin, Global CIO for Alti Tiedemann Global, which manages $70 billion in assets. And Nancy, you're such a voice for us when it comes to artificial intelligence, whether it's hype or reality. And I'm interested as to whether you think the second half will bode well if you're long some of these names like NVIDIA and the chip stocks.
Well, look, trees don't grow to the sky, so we need to recognize that these stocks have run a lot already. Having said that, you know, NVIDIA's got a lot of its sleeve in terms of new product development, right? We've got Blackwell coming on in 2025. We've got Rubin thereafter. And so there's quite a lot of product development. NVIDIA does enjoy a competitive